Do you think the Rothschild Surrealist Ball was just an eccentric dinner party for the bored elite of the 1970s? A simple gathering where Audrey Hepburn wore a birdcage on her head and Salvador Dali posed with taxidermy for the sake of avant-garde art? What if I told you that the photographs you have seen, the ones that circulate on the internet as evidence of the weird habits of the ultra-rich, are actually a carefully curated distraction? What if I told you that beneath the velvet, the diamonds, and the surrealist costumes, a ritual was taking place that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with a feeding frenzy that wasn't for the guests, but for what was living inside of them? The official story is that on December 12, 1972, Marie-Helene de Rothschild hosted the ultimate costume ball at the Château de Ferrières, located just outside of Paris. It is recorded in social columns as the pinnacle of high society excess. But there is another record, a record that was never meant to be seen by the public. In 2003, during the renovation of a condemned building in the Montmartre district of Paris, a demolition crew found a metal box hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of a small apartment. Inside was the diary of a man named Pierre L., a waiter who had vanished from public records shortly after working a singular, high-profile event in the winter of 1972. His diary does not describe a party. It describes a crime scene. It describes a night where the boundaries between the physical world and a parasitic dimension were deliberately thinned. And it claims that the event was not a celebration, but a contract renewal. A ritual that required specific biological materials, specific frequencies, and a specific sacrifice to maintain the power of the families sitting at those tables. This is the story that Stanley Kubrick died trying to tell you. This is the truth that was cut from the final 24 minutes of Eyes Wide Shut. And this is the reason why, if you look closely at the eyes of the guests in those famous photographs, you will see that nobody is truly smiling. The conditioning began before the guests even arrived at the chateau. The invitations sent by the Baroness were not standard cards. They were written in reverse. To read the text, the recipient had to hold the invitation up to a mirror. Art historians and biographers have dismissed this as a whimsical nod to the surrealist love for inversion and dream logic. But in the world of high-level occultism, the mirror is never just a reflective surface. It is a portal. Inversion is the language of the adversary. By forcing every guest to read the invitation through a mirror, the organizers were forcing them to symbolically enter the inverted world before they even stepped foot on the property. It was a binding clause. By accepting the invitation in the mirror, they were agreeing to leave their human morality on the other side of the glass. When the limousines arrived at the Château de Ferrières that night, the building was lit in a way that suggested it was being consumed by hellfire. Moving orange and red lights bathed the facade, creating the illusion that the chateau was burning. But the guests did not walk through the front door. They were forced to crawl. The entrance was blocked by a massive, intricate tunnel made of black ribbons and heavy fabric, designed to look like a giant spider's web. Pierre's diary provides a detail that no photograph could capture. He wrote that hidden inside the layers of this spiderweb tunnel were high-fidelity speakers playing a constant, low-frequency hum. This was infrasound. It was a frequency just below the range of human hearing, known to cause feelings of dread, nausea, and, most importantly, psychological dissociation. As the most powerful people in the world crawled through that dark, suffocating web, they were being neurologically prepped. They were being broken down. By the time they emerged into the grand hall, where servants dressed as cats were hissing and purring at them, they were no longer the CEOs, the artists, or the royalty they were in the daylight. They were blank slates, ready to be written upon. The main dining experience is where the true nightmare began. You have likely seen the photos of the tables. You have seen the fur-lined plates and the bizarre centerpieces. But have you ever looked closely at what was scattered among the silverware? The tables were littered with the parts of what appeared to be plastic dolls. Severed arms, legs, torsos, and heads with glassy staring eyes. The official explanation is that this was a tribute to the artist Hans Bellmer, who created unsettling sculptures of disjointed doll parts to critique the artificiality of the human body. Pierre's account shatters this explanation. He wrote that when he was setting the tables hours before the guests arrived, he accidentally dropped one of the doll arms. It didn't clatter like plastic. It made a dull, wet thud. When he picked it up, it felt warm. He described the texture not as celluloid or porcelain, but as resin-coated organic matter. The smell rising from the centerpieces was not the smell of old toys. It was a metallic coppery scent that the heavy floral arrangements could not fully mask. The terrifying implication of the diary is that these were not manufactured dolls. They were biological containers. 1972 was a year marked by a statistical anomaly in the number of missing children reports across France and Belgium, particularly from state-run institutions where records could easily be misplaced or destroyed. The theory, supported by the suppression of Pierre's autopsy report years later, is that these doll parts were the result of a dark alchemy. They were vessels. In certain left-hand path rituals, a biological object that has witnessed extreme trauma can act as a battery, holding a charge of negative energy, what some esoteric traditions call louche. The elite were not just dining among art, they were dining inside a battery grid. They were feeding on the energy radiating from the centerpieces just as much as they were feeding on the food. And the food itself. The menus that night were filled with puns and surrealist jokes. Dishes like insomnia soup and the devil's ribs. But the centerpiece of the banquet was the anatomy cake. There is a famous photo of this too. A life-sized naked woman made of pastry and sugar, lying on a bed of roses, her abdomen sliced open to reveal red, fleshy entrails. The guests are seen laughing, holding knives, cutting into the body. Pierre was in the room when the cake was cut. He was holding the silver tray for the Baroness. He wrote that when the knife breached the chest cavity of the cake, the sound was not the crunch of meringue or the slide of sponge. It was the tearing of fibrous tissue. He described the substance inside, not as jam or coulis, but as a dark coagulating fluid that smelled of iron. He watched as a prominent banker, a man whose signature is on the currency of a G7 nation, took a bite of the cake and immediately gagged. He turned pale, sweating profusely. A masked server stepped forward, whispered something into the banker's ear, and the man swallowed. He finished the plate. This was not a dessert. It was a test of complicity. By consuming the flesh, even if it was disguised, the guests were binding themselves to the pact. They were proving that there was no taboo they would not break, no line they would not cross. It was a ritual of dehumanization, designed to strip away the last remnants of empathy so that these individuals could go back out into the world and make the cold, hard decisions that steer the course of history without the burden of a conscience. But the most disturbing element of the Rothschild ball, and the one that connects directly to the death of Stanley Kubrick, was the masks. The dress code was mandatory. Black tie, long dresses, and surrealist heads. The guests wore elaborate, bizarre masks. Some had multiple faces, some had cages, some, like the Baroness, wore animal heads with diamond tears. We are told this was for fashion. But in the context of the ritual, the mask is a tool of possession. Pierre's diary details a shift in the atmosphere that occurred exactly at 2 a.m. The music changed. The waltzes stopped, replaced by a rhythmic, dissonant drumming that seemed to have no consistent time signature. It was at this moment that the behavior of the guests changed. Pierre observed that the guests stopped speaking in their native languages. The chatter in French, English, and German ceased. It was replaced by a low, synchronized humming, and then a series of guttural clicking sounds. The guests' movements became jerky, almost mechanical. They were no longer moving like intoxicated partygoers. They were moving like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. The masks were not hiding their identities. They were suppressing their humanity. The specific geometries of the masks, the cages, the horns, the multiple faces, these were sigils. They acted as antennas. The ritual was designed to allow archontic entities, parasitic interdimensional intelligences, to temporarily inhabit the bodies of the global elite. For a few hours, the people who ran the world were not people at all. They were vessels. The decisions made during those hours, the agreements whispered through the eye holes of those surrealist masks, were not of human origin. Salvador Dali was there. Dali, the man who claimed to paint his dreams, who claimed to know the subconscious better than Freud. Look at the photos of Dali from that night. He is the only one who looks truly afraid. In every frame, he seems small, huddled, his eyes wide with a terror that goes beyond social anxiety. Dali realized that night that his surrealism was a child's toy compared to the reality of the elite. He saw that what he painted as a metaphor, these people lived as a literal truth. He left the party early, and in his later years, his work took on a darker, more religious tone, as if he were trying to repent for what he had witnessed. Stanley Kubrick knew. Kubrick was not just a director, he was a researcher of the highest order. When he began production on Eyes Wide Shut, he told the world it was a story about sexual jealousy. That was the cover. The real story was the party. Kubrick had studied the Rothschild ball. He had sources in the intelligence community who whispered to him about what really happened in those chateaus. He knew about the dolls. He knew about the meat. He knew about the entities. The film we saw in theaters is a masterpiece, but it is a censored masterpiece. Insiders from the production have whispered for decades that the original cut of the film, the one Kubrick screened for Warner Brothers executives just 6 days before he died, was significantly different. It was 24 minutes longer, and those missing 24 minutes did not contain more dialogue between Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. They contained the ritual. Kubrick had reconstructed the dinner scene. He had filmed the consumption of the cake. He had filmed the moment the entities took control of the masked guests. He explicitly showed that the secret society was not just a sex cult, but a group of high-level black magicians who ran the world through blood contracts. When the executives saw this, the room went cold. They told him it was impossible. They told him it was too dangerous. Kubrick, the man who had total final cut privilege, refused to change a frame. 6 days later, Stanley Kubrick was dead. The official cause was a massive heart attack. But Kubrick was known to be in robust health, with the cardiovascular system of a man 20 years his junior. He was paranoid about his safety, rarely leaving his estate, and he had his own food and water supply. The timing is a statistical impossibility. He delivers the most exposing film in history, and less than a week later, he is silenced. Immediately after his death, studio agents arrived at his estate in England. They didn't just take the film reels. They took his notes. They took his journals. They took the research photos he had gathered of the 1972 ball. The film was delayed. It was brought back into the editing room. The 24 minutes were excised, burned, or perhaps locked in a vault deep underground as leverage. The version of Eyes Wide Shut that was released was a neutered version, a dream sequence instead of a documentary. But even in its censored form, the message remains. The passwords, the masks, the circle of power, it is all there for those who have eyes to see. You might be thinking that this is ancient history. That 1972 was a long time ago. That is the most dangerous mistake you can make. The Rothschild ball was not a one-off event. It was a soft disclosure. It was a test to see how much they could show the public without the public realizing what they were looking at. And because we didn't recoil, because we called it art and fashion, the ritual has only grown. Look at the modern world. Look at the Met Gala. Look at the fashion shows of Balenciaga and Schiaparelli. Look at the music videos of the biggest pop stars. What do you see? You see the same imagery. You see the faceless masks. You see the obsession with cannibalism, with blood, with the distortion of the human form. You see celebrities walking red carpets carrying replicas of their own severed heads. You see spirit cooking dinners being discussed in leaked emails. They are no longer hiding in a French chateau. They are performing the ritual on live television. They are casting the spell in plain sight. And by watching it, by clicking on it, by debating whether the dress looked good or bad, you are participating. You are the battery now. Your attention is the energy they harvest. The dolls on the table are no longer resin mummified limbs. They are us. We are the silent observers, sitting at the table, feeding the entities with our fear and our fascination. Pierre L. knew this. The last entry in his diary, written the morning he fled Paris, is a warning that echoes through the decades. He wrote that, as he was leaving the chateau grounds, escaping through the servants' gate, he saw the Baroness standing by the edge of the labyrinth. She had removed her stag mask. She was watching him leave. She didn't call security. She didn't scream. She simply smiled. But Pierre noted that her smile was too wide, and her teeth were stained with a dark, fibrous substance. She raised a single finger to her lips in a shushing motion. He wrote, "I have left the chateau, but I have not left the maze. The web is not just on the door. The web is the world, and we are all just waiting for the spider to get hungry again." Pierre was found dead 3 months later. The police ruled it a suicide, despite the fact that his hands were bound behind his back. The story of the Rothschild Surrealist Ball is not a history lesson. It is a diagnosis of our current reality. The masks never came off. The party never ended. The music just got louder so you couldn't hear the screams. So what do you do with this information? Now that you know the truth behind the photos, now that you know why Kubrick had to die, you have a choice. You can dismiss this as a conspiracy theory. You can go back to scrolling, back to watching the red carpet, back to sleeping with your eyes wide shut. That is what they want. That is what keeps the battery charged. Or you can cut the strings. The entities that feed on this energy rely on your consent. They rely on your silence and your passive acceptance of their symbols. But once you see the symbol for what it is, the spell breaks. Once you realize that the avant-garde art is a confession, their power over your perception crumbles. They are watching this video. The algorithm is designed to track who engages with this level of truth. They want to know who is waking up. They want to know who the threats are. If you have watched this far, you are already on the radar. You have already looked in the mirror and seen the inverted writing. Do not share it with friends who are not ready to handle the weight of this reality. Those are the actions of the asleep. Instead, if you have truly understood, if you have seen the wires that move the puppets, I want you to leave a specific mark, a digital sigil of your own. Go to the comments and write only one phrase. I cut my strings. That is the signal. That is how we know who has left the labyrinth. That is how we tell them that we are no longer guests at their table. We are the storm outside their windows. But be careful tonight. When you turn off your screen, when the house is quiet, try not to look too long at your reflection in the mirror. You might notice that the room behind you in the reflection doesn't look quite the same as the room you are standing in. You might notice that your reflection is smiling just a split second after you do. You might feel the heavy, suffocating pressure of a spider web that you can't see but can definitely feel. They know you know. The party is over, but the hunt has just begun. I cut my strings. Did you?